Do not move another inch. The words cut through the cold air outside the Federal District building as Alicia Carter stood still under the flashing glow of emergency lights, her hands raised slightly in calm compliance rather than resistance, her breath steady even as several officers closed the distance around her, not with chaos but with procedural precision that made the moment feel heavier than noise ever could. Officer Brian Hayes kept his focus locked on her face as if certainty alone could justify what was unfolding, repeating that she was being detained for resisting lawful instructions, though nothing in her posture matched the accusation being spoken aloud. Alicia wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, her ID badge still clipped neatly at her waist from the building she had just exited minutes earlier, a place where classified briefings and national security assessments were part of her daily work, though none of that context seemed to reach the situation forming around her now. The sidewalk behind her filled quickly with passers-by slowing their steps, phones lifting instinctively, capturing fragments of a story no one fully understood yet, only the surface tension of authority meeting confusion. Inside the nearest patrol unit, radio chatter crackled in controlled bursts, while Captain William Reed arrived with the measured urgency of someone who believed procedure could resolve perception, his gaze briefly scanning Alicia before defaulting to the assumption that reports from his officers were already sufficient. "Comply and this will be resolved quickly," he said, not unkindly but firmly, as though resolution depended only on submission, not truth. Alicia looked at him directly, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something anchored, and replied, "I am complying. I have been from the start. There is a misunderstanding that needs to be corrected before this goes any further." The word misunderstanding hung in the air longer than expected, because it did not match the certainty being enforced around her. Officer Hayes exchanged a glance with another officer, then gestured for her to remain still as standard procedure. Continued, while the crowd's murmurs grew into a low, uncertain rhythm. Alicia did not raise her voice, did not shift her stance, did not attempt to pull attention through emotion, she simply waited, as if patience itself was a form of control she understood better than anyone present. Moments passed in uneven silence, broken only by radio static and distant traffic, until Captain Reed motioned slightly toward the transport unit, signaling a step forward in a process that appeared irreversible from the outside. That was when Alicia finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, almost conversational, as she said she needed a single phone call, not as a request for sympathy, but as a confirmation of protocol she knew she was entitled to. Officer Hayes exhaled sharply, interpreting it as delay, not realization, while Captain Reed hesitated for half a second longer than he intended to, before responding that procedure would be followed in sequence. Alicia nodded once, as if acknowledging a system she already knew from the inside, and quietly added that if that call was made, it would not come from a personal contact list, but from a secured line that very few outside her world would recognize, a detail that did not change the moment immediately, but subtly altered the air around it, as though something unseen had just shifted beneath the surface of what everyone thought they were witnessing. The interior of the patrol vehicle felt smaller than it should have been, not because of its physical space but because of the silence inside it, a silence that pressed against Alicia Carter as she sat upright with her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze directed forward rather than toward the officers positioned on either side of her, as if she had chosen distance over reaction. Outside, the city continued moving with its usual rhythm, taxis passing through intersections, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, and office lights beginning to glow in the early evening, unaware that a situation unfolding on one street corner carried more institutional weight than anyone nearby could have guessed. Officer Brian Hayes checked something on his radio, then glanced at her again. His expression still fixed in the assumption that the situation was straightforward, that procedures were already justified by what he believed he had witnessed. Alicia finally spoke without turning her head, her voice calm and evenly paced, asking if the report filed included the full context of her exit from the federal building, a question that landed differently than intended, because it suggested detail rather than confusion, structure rather than panic. Hayes responded that context was irrelevant to resisting lawful instruction, repeating the phrasing as if repetition strengthened accuracy. Alicia did not argue, she only nodded once, then said that lawful instruction depended on correct identification of authority, a statement that introduced a subtle shift in the atmosphere without raising her volume or changing her tone. The vehicle slowed at a traffic light, and for a brief moment the reflections of passing headlights moved across the interior like drifting lines of pale gold, illuminating the calm expression on her face in a way that made her presence feel less like a detainee and more like someone observing a misunderstanding from a distance she had already measured. Behind them, another patrol unit followed at a consistent interval, maintaining formation as protocol required, while dispatch continued to relay updates in clipped sentences that emphasized procedure over uncertainty. At the precinct, Captain William Reed reviewed preliminary notes with a focus that suggested confidence, his attention fixed on the narrative forming through official channels rather than the unfolding reality still in motion. He instructed that standard intake processing should proceed, emphasizing that escalation was unnecessary unless additional information contradicted initial reports. Meanwhile, Alicia leaned slightly back against the seat, her eyes briefly closing for a moment that felt less like fatigue and more like calculation, as if she were aligning facts that others had not yet connected. She opened her eyes again when Officer Hayes mentioned that once processing was complete, she would be formally advised of her rights and next steps, to which she responded quietly that her rights were already established under federal clearance protocols that extended beyond municipal jurisdiction. The statement caused a pause in conversation, not dramatic, but noticeable enough to alter the rhythm inside the vehicle, because it did not match the expectation of uncertainty or submission. Hayes frowned slightly, asking for clarification, but Alicia did not elaborate further, instead stating that the only clarification required would come from a secure communication line that had not yet been accessed. The traffic light turned green, and the vehicle continued forward, but the tone inside it had changed, as if an invisible boundary had been crossed between assumption and verification, leaving everyone inside aware that the next sequence of events would depend less on what they believed and more on what could be confirmed. The vehicle turned off the main avenue and entered a controlled access road leading toward the federal intake facility, where the lighting became more structured and the environment shifted from public unpredictability to institutional order, marked by evenly spaced lamps and reinforced gates that opened and closed with deliberate timing. Inside the car, Alicia Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, her attention fixed forward as if she were not being transported into custody processing but instead moving through a system she had encountered many times before under entirely different circumstances. Officer Brian Hayes adjusted his position slightly, glancing at the digital console mounted near the dashboard, confirming arrival protocols as the building ahead grew larger and more defined through the windshield. Captain William Reed was already present at the facility entrance, having arrived ahead of the transport unit, standing beside a cluster of administrative personnel who were reviewing initial reports on handheld devices. As the vehicle slowed, Reed raised a hand signaling standard approach, his expression controlled but attentive, as though balancing expectation with procedural caution. Alicia finally turned her head slightly, observing the facility entrance without visible tension, then spoke in a calm voice, stating that once inside, protocol would require verification through a secure federal identification system, a detail that caused Officer Hayes to briefly look at her again with a subtle shift in attention, though he did not respond. The vehicle came to a complete stop, and the surrounding environment settled into a quiet stillness broken only by distant mechanical doors and the faint hum of security systems cycling through readiness checks. As the door opened, the air outside carried a cooler temperature, and Alicia stepped out without hesitation, maintaining steady movement guided by procedural instruction rather than urgency or resistance. She was escorted through a glass entry corridor where security personnel observed from multiple checkpoints, their attention divided between standard intake procedure and the unusual composure she displayed under circumstances that typically generated visible stress. Captain Reed walked slightly ahead, reviewing a tablet displaying preliminary case notes, his focus narrowing as inconsistencies began to appear in the timeline provided by field officers compared to internal facility logs. At the first verification station, Alicia paused only long enough to present identification credentials stored within a secure digital format, prompting a brief exchange between administrative staff who initiated a secondary validation process without verbal comment. Officer Hayes watched the interaction closely, his earlier certainty beginning to feel less absolute as procedural confirmations extended beyond standard duration. Inside the adjacent operations room, communication lines opened between federal oversight channels and local command, introducing a level of review that required escalation authorization beyond precinct authority. Alicia remained silent during this process, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression neutral yet attentive, as though waiting for a sequence she had already anticipated. Captain Reed stepped aside briefly to receive a direct communication request through his secure device, his posture shifting slightly as he listened without interruption. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but its effect was immediate, altering the flow of activity within the intake area as personnel adjusted their attention toward updated instructions. Officer Hayes, now positioned near the entry threshold, observed the change in tone among staff, noting that the earlier assumption of a routine detention was no longer reflected in the operational environment. Alicia was asked to remain in a designated holding observation area while verification continued, and she complied without hesitation, moving calmly to the indicated space. As she sat, the lighting above her remained steady and controlled, casting a neutral tone across the room, while outside the glass partition, administrative personnel continued processing information at an accelerated pace. Captain Reed lowered his device slightly, his expression now less certain than before, as the situation transitioned from field interpretation to federal review, where jurisdictional boundaries began to redefine every assumption made up to that point. Inside the federal intake facility, the atmosphere had shifted from procedural motion to structured reassessment, where every movement by staff carried a different weight than before, as if the system itself had paused to re-evaluate what it had initially accepted as a routine detention. Alicia Carter remained seated in the observation area with her back straight and her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her expression unchanged, not because she was detached from the situation, but because she was operating within a framework that no longer depended on local interpretation. Behind the glass partition, Captain William Reed stood with two administrative supervisors reviewing updated clearance signals arriving through secured channels, each message tightening the scope of authority that now applied to the case. Officer Brian Hayes remained near the corridor entrance, his earlier certainty replaced by quiet observation, as he noticed the gradual change in how personnel addressed one another, shifting from assumption-based instructions to confirmation-based communication. A senior federal liaison arrived through a controlled side entrance, carrying a sealed electronic tablet that required biometric access, and upon activation, the tone of the room subtly changed, not through announcement, but through recognition. Alicia was not moved, nor was she questioned further at that moment. Instead, the verification process expanded across multiple secure networks, each one confirming identity layers that extended far beyond municipal jurisdiction. Captain Reed received a direct instruction to pause all local processing until federal confirmation was complete, a directive that caused him to lower his device and step away from the main console, his posture now reflecting recalibration rather than command. Officer Hayes watched as the intake supervisor quietly adjusted case classification codes on the internal system, reassigning oversight levels in real time, and he realized that the situation he had approached as straightforward was no longer contained within the framework he understood. Alicia finally shifted her gaze slightly toward the glass wall, observing the increased activity without urgency, as if she had expected this transition from the beginning, her calm presence contrasting with the accelerating procedural response around her. A second communication arrived, this time requiring Captain Reed to enter a secure audio channel, and as he listened, his expression tightened briefly before settling into controlled acknowledgement, indicating that jurisdiction had officially shifted beyond his authority. Inside the observation area, Alicia was offered water and informed that she was not being processed under standard detention protocol, but rather held temporarily under verification review pending confirmation from federal oversight, a distinction that subtly redefined everything that had occurred up to that point. She accepted the update without reaction, only nodding once, as if acknowledging information she had already anticipated long before it was formally stated. Officer Hayes took a step back from the corridor threshold, his attention moving from enforcement perspective to procedural awareness, now recognizing that the earlier arrest narrative was no longer the governing structure of the event. The lighting in the facility remained steady, the environment unchanged physically, yet entirely different in function, as systems previously dormant under local control were now active under federal validation pathways. Captain Reed remained near the central console, no longer issuing directives, only receiving instructions, while the room around him continued to adjust in small but irreversible ways that signaled the full transition of authority had already taken place. The federal intake facility had entered a different operational rhythm, one that no longer resembled local enforcement procedure but instead reflected layered oversight, where every action was filtered through confirmation chains that extended beyond the room itself. Alicia Carter remained seated in the observation area, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting calmly, as if time had stopped affecting her personally while it continued to accelerate around her. Inside the control corridor, Captain William Reed stood slightly apart from the main console, no longer issuing instructions but instead receiving intermittent updates from multiple secured channels, each one reinforcing that the case was no longer under municipal authority in any meaningful sense. Officer Brian Hayes stayed near the threshold of the corridor, his attention fixed on the subtle but unmistakable changes in tone among staff members, who now spoke in shorter confirmations and deferred responses, replacing earlier certainty with procedural caution. A federal communications officer entered the operations room carrying a sealed access device, and upon activation of the secure line, the environment shifted again, not through sound or announcement, but through collective recognition of authority escalation that required immediate compliance. Alicia was not moved or questioned further, but her status designation within the system updated in real time, transitioning from temporary detention review to protected federal verification hold, a classification that triggered additional safeguards across interconnected databases. Captain Reed reviewed the updated classification on his device, and for the first time since his arrival, he paused without speaking, as if recalibrating his understanding of what the situation had been from the beginning. Officer Hayes observed a quiet exchange between two administrative staff members who were now cross-referencing identification protocols with federal clearance registries, their expressions neutral but focused, signaling that the earlier assumptions guiding the arrest narrative were no longer valid within the operational framework. Alicia finally stood from the observation seat without prompting, not in reaction to instruction, but in response to procedural acknowledgement that her presence was now required in a secure consultation area. She moved calmly through the corridor accompanied by two federal personnel, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, while the surrounding facility adjusted its internal routing to accommodate a classification level that had not been active in the system for several months. As she passed through a secondary security checkpoint, biometric verification completed in silence, triggering automatic clearance notifications that propagated through multiple agency layers simultaneously. Captain Reed received a direct directive instructing him to suspend all local reporting pending federal review, a message that effectively removed his decision-making authority from the case, leaving him standing in place with nothing to execute. Officer Hayes lowered his gaze briefly, recognizing that the structure he had relied upon throughout the initial encounter was no longer the structure governing the situation. Inside the secure consultation room, Alicia was offered a standard briefing chair and a communication interface, though she did not immediately engage with it, instead waiting as the system finalized external confirmation loops. Within minutes, a secure line connected to a remote federal office activated, and an official voice confirmed identity validation, noting that all prior municipal actions would now undergo compliance review under federal oversight protocol. The statement was delivered without emotion, yet its implication redefined the entire sequence of events that had led to this moment. Alicia acknowledged the confirmation with a single calm response, indicating understanding. While outside the room, facility staff adjusted their workflows once again, shifting from verification mode to documentation review. Captain Reed remained motionless near the central console, his earlier assumptions fully replaced by procedural uncertainty, as the system continued to reassign authority levels beyond his operational scope. Officer Hayes took one final look toward the secure room before stepping back into the corridor, now aware that the incident was no longer a local enforcement matter, but part of a broader institutional review that had already begun to extend beyond the walls of the facility. The secure consultation room was now operating under a controlled federal protocol that replaced earlier intake uncertainty with structured review, where every transmission, every update, and every verification cycle was logged in real time across multiple agency networks. Alicia Carter remained seated at the center of this environment, her presence calm and unchanged, as if the escalation that had consumed the facility around her existed in a different layer of reality that did not alter her internal focus. Across the glass partition, federal communication staff monitored encrypted channels that continued to confirm identity alignment across classified registries, each confirmation reducing ambiguity and reinforcing a status designation that had now fully overwritten all prior municipal classifications. Captain William Reed stood near the outer control panel, no longer interfacing with command systems directly, his role reduced to observation as jurisdictional control had been fully transferred upward through the chain of authority. Officer Brian Hayes remained in the adjacent corridor, his posture steady but reflective, watching as internal screens updated case metadata with corrections that restructured the entire foundation of the initial arrest documentation. Inside the consultation room, Alicia finally engaged with the secured communication interface, not in haste, but with measured precision, as a federal analyst on the other end initiated a formal verification dialogue that confirmed her clearance level across defense oversight systems. The exchange was brief, consisting primarily of confirmation codes and identity markers, yet each line of communication carried institutional weight that extended far beyond the physical space of the room. Outside, facility personnel adjusted their workflows again, now transitioning from verification procedures into audit preparation protocols, signaling that the event was no longer an active detention matter but a case under formal federal review. Captain Reed received a final notification on his device indicating suspension of all local reporting authority pending external compliance evaluation, and for the first time since his arrival, he lowered the device without further action, accepting that his operational role in the matter had concluded. Officer Hayes observed a senior administrative coordinator quietly revising the incident timeline within the central system, removing earlier assumptions of resistance and replacing them with revised procedural entries that reflected the updated classification. Alicia remained composed, her attention directed toward the communication interface only when necessary, responding to verification prompts with concise confirmations that maintained the efficiency of the process. A final confirmation signal arrived from the Federal Oversight Channel, indicating full recognition of clearance status and authorization to proceed with debrief protocol, effectively closing the verification loop that had been expanding since her initial detention. The room's atmosphere shifted subtly once more, not through sound or visible change, but through the cessation of uncertainty, as systems settled into resolved classification states. Captain Reed stood still, his earlier expectations fully replaced by procedural finality, while Officer Hayes took note of the last system update that marked the case as transitioned from enforcement action to protected federal review incident. Alicia stood from the chair without urgency, as if the conclusion of the verification process had simply restored her to a normal state of movement, and she was guided toward the exit corridor where federal personnel prepared to escort her beyond the intake zone. As she walked, the facility behind her continued its quiet recalibration, archiving records, updating logs, and stabilizing system entries that now reflected a fundamentally different interpretation of everything that had occurred since her arrival. The final corridor leading out of the federal intake facility was quieter than any space Alicia Carter had moved through since her arrival, not because activity had ceased, but because the nature of that activity had changed into something administrative rather than reactive, where personnel no longer responded with urgency but with completion. She walked forward at a steady pace accompanied by two federal escorts, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as overhead lighting transitioned from sterile intake white to softer institutional illumination that marked the boundary between secure processing and external release protocols. Behind her, the facility continued its internal recalibration, with systems finalizing audit logs that replaced earlier enforcement entries with revised federal classifications, ensuring that every recorded action aligned with the updated jurisdictional outcome. Captain William Reed remained inside the operations corridor, now fully removed from decision authority, observing final confirmation screens that displayed case closure under federal oversight review, his presence reduced to that of a witness to procedural transition rather than an active participant. Officer Brian Hayes stood farther back near the secondary corridor junction, watching as the last of the intake notifications cleared from his device, replaced by a single archived status line indicating that all prior assumptions regarding the incident had been formally superseded. Alicia reached the exterior transition doors, where biometric clearance verification completed one final time, producing a soft confirmation tone that signaled the end of restricted access. The doors opened smoothly, revealing the outside environment where daylight felt unchanged yet subtly distant, as if the time spent inside the facility had altered perception more than duration. She stepped through without hesitation, pausing only briefly as federal personnel confirmed release protocol completion through handheld verification devices, after which they stepped back, leaving her standing alone just beyond the threshold. For the first time since the initial encounter, there were no procedural instructions directing her movement, no enforcement presence interpreting her actions, only open space and regulated silence. Inside the facility, Captain Reed finally lowered his gaze from the final status report, noting that the entire incident had transitioned into a sealed federal review file, no longer accessible through local channels. Officer Hayes turned away from the corridor window, his attention shifting from observation to reflection, as he processed the full sequence of events that had moved from apparent standard enforcement to complete jurisdictional reversal without any visible escalation in the physical moment itself. Outside, Alicia continued forward along the paved walkway leading away from the building, her steps measured and unhurried, as passing vehicles moved along the adjacent road in normal flow, unaware of the procedural transformation that had just concluded behind her. A federal liaison exited briefly to confirm final clearance, then returned inside without additional comment, allowing the exterior space to settle into ordinary motion once again. Alicia reached the edge of the facility perimeter where public access resumed, and she paused for a brief moment, not as a reaction to what had occurred, but as a natural transition between controlled environment and unrestricted space. Behind her, the facility doors closed quietly, sealing the internal process within administrative systems that would continue to run audits and compliance reviews long after physical presence had ended. She then continued walking forward, disappearing gradually into the flow of the city, while inside the facility every record of the incident finalized into its permanent federal archive state, marking the end of active review and the beginning of institutional accountability processing. The city outside the federal facility had already returned to its normal rhythm, but for Alicia Carter, that rhythm now felt subtly different, as if the distance between what had happened and what continued to happen had been quietly redefined by the weight of institutional acknowledgement. She walked along the sidewalk with steady pace, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, while vehicles passed at standard speed and pedestrians moved through intersections unaware that a full federal verification cycle had just concluded behind her. Inside the facility, the final stage of documentation processing continued without her presence, as systems automatically compiled audit records, closed jurisdictional flags, and archived the entire case file into a secured federal repository that required multi-layer authorization for future access. Captain William Reed remained inside the operations corridor, no longer in command position, watching as the last active notifications disappeared from his terminal, replaced by a final confirmation status indicating case closure under federal review authority. Officer Brian Hayes stood near the exit corridor, observing the administrative staff complete the final procedural resets, his attention focused less on the system now and more on the realization that every assumption made at the beginning of the incident had been systematically replaced by verified classification data that contradicted the initial enforcement interpretation. A senior federal coordinator issued a final internal directive confirming that all local reporting related to the event would be consolidated under a single oversight channel, effectively removing independent municipal narrative control from the record. Alicia continued walking several blocks away from the facility, her movement unhurried, as if the transition from controlled environment to public space required no adjustment beyond the simple act of forward motion. The air felt open, the noise of the city consistent, yet the sequence of events that had just concluded remained embedded in the structured systems behind her, now locked into compliance archives and oversight documentation layers that would continue processing internal review metrics long after the physical moment had passed. Inside the facility, Captain Reed finally set down his device, no longer receiving updates, only static confirmation that the case had entered final administrative closure status, while Officer Hayes turned away from the corridor glass, his focus shifting from procedural observation to internal reflection on how quickly perceived certainty had dissolved under federal verification. Alicia reached a busier intersection where civilian movement increased, blending her back into ordinary flow without distinction, though the procedural transformation surrounding her identity still existed in secured networks that no longer required her physical presence to remain active. Behind her, the federal facility doors remained closed, marked only by standard access indicators, while internal systems continued final synchronization of audit trails, ensuring that every recorded detail aligned with the updated classification outcome. Captain Reed left the operations area shortly after, his steps measured, his expression neutral but altered, as he passed through corridors that no longer required his authority or input. Officer Hayes followed later, pausing once at the facility threshold before stepping outside, where the ambient city noise replaced the controlled silence of the intake environment. Alicia disappeared gradually into pedestrian movement, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding flow of the city, while inside the facility the final audit compilation completed, sealing the entire sequence into federal record structure that confirmed procedural resolution and jurisdictional transfer as permanent institutional fact. The morning after the federal review closure carried a quietness that felt different from ordinary routine, as if the city itself had not changed but the awareness of what had occurred within it had shifted permanently in the background of institutional memory. Alicia Carter stood near a public transit platform a few blocks from the federal facility, holding a small travel bag at her side, her posture composed, her expression steady, as commuters passed in both directions without recognizing the significance of the events that had concluded only hours earlier. The system of record behind those events had already completed its final synchronization, locking the entire case into federal archival structure where it would remain subject to oversight review but no longer active enforcement. Inside federal channels, the last administrative flags were marked as resolved, confirming full jurisdictional transfer and closing all local authority references that had initially defined the encounter. Captain William Reed had returned to his precinct earlier that morning, where he submitted a formal acknowledgement report stating that all procedural actions had been superseded by federal directive, his language precise, neutral, and compliant with the final classification outcome. Officer Brian Hayes completed his own internal statement shortly after, noting inconsistencies between initial field assumptions and verified identity clearance results, his report reflecting a measured understanding of how rapidly perceived certainty had dissolved under structured verification. Neither officer returned to the federal facility after submission, as their roles in the matter were formally concluded upon final system confirmation. Alicia boarded a bus without delay when it arrived, selecting a seat near the window, where she sat calmly as the vehicle pulled away from the platform and merged into the city traffic flow, her presence now indistinguishable from any other passenger moving through the morning commute. The streets outside continued their usual patterns, with delivery vehicles stopping at intersections, office workers entering buildings, and signals cycling through timed intervals that maintained urban rhythm without interruption. Within federal archives, the completed case file transitioned into long-term storage, accessible only through layered authorization protocols that required simultaneous clearance from multiple oversight divisions, ensuring that the full scope of the incident remained preserved but restricted. Captain Reed, now outside the formal chain of command for the case, reviewed a summary notice indicating that all actions had been recorded under federal compliance review standards, a notification that required no response but confirmed final closure of his involvement. Officer Hayes, on the other hand, remained seated in his precinct office for several minutes after submitting his report, staring at the blank space where the case file had once appeared in active systems, processing the realization that what had initially seemed like a straightforward enforcement action had instead been part of a larger institutional structure he had only briefly encountered. Alicia arrived at a modest residential district by late morning, stepping off the bus with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout every stage of the process, carrying no visible indication of the procedural escalation that had occurred around her just hours earlier. She walked down the sidewalk lined with evenly spaced trees and quiet homes, where everyday life continued uninterrupted, as if the events behind federal glass walls had existed in a separate layer of reality that only intersected briefly with the surface of the city. Inside the federal system, final audit verification completed its last cycle, confirming that all procedural actions had been properly classified, all jurisdictional transfers validated, and all enforcement records reconciled under unified oversight standards. With that final confirmation, the entire sequence of events transitioned from active review status into permanent institutional record, leaving behind only structured documentation and secured archives that preserved what had occurred without further operational presence. The city remained unchanged on the surface, but within its systems of record, the event had already been finalized, sealed, and integrated into the deeper framework of federal oversight history, marking the quiet end of a process that had begun in confusion and concluded in absolute procedural closure.